Gracen Brilmyer uses they, them pronouns and is an assistant professor in the School of Information Studies at McGill University and the director of the Disability Archive Lab. Their research lies at the intersection of feminist disability studies and archival studies, where they investigate the ways in which disabled people use, experience, and understand themselves through archives, as well as how to tell histories of disability when there's little or no archival evidence. Their writing on disability history, archival methodologies, and the history of science has been featured in publications such as the Journal of Feminist Scholarship and Archival Science. Alice Wong uses she, her pronouns and is a disabled activist, writer, media maker, and consultant. She's the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project, an online community dedicated to creating, sharing, and amplifying disability media and culture, created in 2014. Alice is the editor of Disability Visibility, First Person Stories from the 21st Century, an anthology of essays by disabled people. And she's currently working on her memoir, which we have a link for, Year of the Tiger, which will be coming out later this year. And you can also find her on Twitter at sfdyerwolf. So Alice and Gracen, as we talked about, we're going to start with just a bit of a check-in question. We're close to the 2-year anniversary of the first COVID lockdown. And the last 2 years have seen racialized violence present and often intertwined with the pandemic. The brutal violence against Black folks, including George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that led to the uprisings of 2020. And white supremacist violence has also been targeting Asian lives, especially our elders and femmes. Christina Yuna Lee is the most recent well-known victim, joining Michelle Go and the 6 Asian women killed back in March 2021. But I want to emphasize that these are just the well-publicized stories, not all of them. So I bring up this context because our individual positionalities shape how the pandemic has felt in the past 2 years, our racial identities, our gender identities, and our identities as disabled people, among other things. So how are each of you doing and feeling as we approach this milestone?
Gracen, do you want to go first, or?
Oh, it's you. Go for it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's really been so thoughtful in organizing this event. You know, I've been on a few other similar kinds of online events. And it's always an interesting experience on how people approach things. And I'm just really touched by the thoughtfulness and the deliberateness and sensitivity that everyone's had in putting this together. So I just want to acknowledge all the labor and solidarity. I'm really excited to be here with you all. So I really want to thank. It's a lot of work. People think that, oh, in-person events are like super difficult and onerous, but I think, you know, we need to also acknowledge that online events are just as much work and take just as much care. So I want to really acknowledge that and be thankful for that. So as people might be able to tell, I am wearing a mask over my nose, which is connected to a ventilator. It's a machine called a BiPAP machine, BiPAP. So, you know, I think the world has never felt really safe for me as a disabled person, as a woman, as an Asian American. But the last 2 years, 2+ years going on, it's really made me think a lot about who gets to breathe, who gets to feel safe, and who gets to be in public. You know, I think these are such, you know, sad questions that we should have always espoused. Everyone belongs to public spaces. You know, there should be freedom of movement. people have rights. But we live in this world where many people still don't. There are still people who are incarcerated and institutionalized against their will. We still have houseless people who are criminalized just for being houseless. So I think, there's a lot of things that have really made me feel like smaller. And in many ways, a lot of forces that just made me feel so fragile, just fragile and tender and tired. And I think that's, part of the experience of being a multiply marginalized person. And, right now, many universities in many states right now are lifting their indoor mask mandates. Many universities are basically reducing access that's to remote learning or to remote work, forcing faculty, staff, and students to make very unfair choices on working or learning versus risking their lives. And to me, that really says a lot, right, about institutions and the state and how violence and eugenics go hand in hand. And this is, it weighs on me, but it also really confirms and compels me to keep doing what I'm doing. So I'm sure we will. That's why we're gathered here today. So I think that's in a nutshell how I feel. Like just some days just so tired of like just trying to live, and then other days just really real grateful for spaces like this. If it wasn't for the pandemic, to be honest, I mean, this is sad that it took a global, massive, disabling event for me to be able to talk to universities all over the world without having to travel. And I don't travel. So I think it's given a lot of disabled people opportunities for the first time. And that to me is also sad too, right? Like we're supposedly in the 21st century now, well into the 21st century, and this is still somehow innovative when it shouldn't be.
I guess, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree, and I'm so grateful for Alice's words. I also really do want to thank Liú and Alice for this conversation that we get to have, for Carlin and Hen and all of the folks who are making this event happen, the interpreters, Maria and Maria, as well as the live captioner, and everyone who worked to make this event more accessible and just to make it possible. Yeah, I think I too am just feeling the exhaustion, the grief, processing multiple violences that are happening right now, thinking about multiple mass disabling events that are happening right now, and even thinking about folks in Ukraine today, and mass disabling events also that impact infrastructure and access to water and resources and care, as well as legislation that is currently impacting trans and queer youth. I move through the world, I think, with a lot of privilege as a white person who has gone through academia, but also as a disabled and chronically ill person and non-binary person with multiple autoimmune illnesses, I think I just will echo Alice's words that it's really hard to have watched the past 2 years and to watch things returning to normal, or for this eugenics thinking that we've seen throughout our lives, many of us, and we saw amplified now get really normalized. But I think I want to also highlight, when I was thinking about this question, many months ago, Alice and I were hanging out, and she asked me this question that now I find myself returning to almost daily, which is, what has been bringing me joy? And a huge thing, I think, is sharing space with other disabled people like Alice and many of my disabled friends, some of whom are here today, and not just holding space in a joyful way, but holding comfortable space for sadness and negativity, where we don't need to put on a facade, where we can be just so present with each other and each other's feelings. So that, I think, has really been shaping how I'm doing, is getting to have community.
Yeah, absolutely. That space is so different when you're with other disabled people. And like you said, like if you're complaining with abled friends, it's really different from when you're just complaining with people who know what that lived experience is, or can relate in their own ways. Let's see, I'm trying to decide where I want to start. So how about let's just start at the beginning. So what are your priorities in archiving disability culture and stories? And what are the responsibilities and ethics you have to yourself and to this community that we're talking about?
I'll just jump in. Why not? Hey, everyone. I love this question because, I'm kind of a one-person operation with the disability project. It started out initially as an oral history campaign where I partnered with a nonprofit called Story Tour, STORYCORPS, and this started in 2014 because I was really annoyed and tired of seeing how there really wasn't disability history, taught anywhere, or just where are our stories, especially our kind of contemporary modern day stories. And that to me was what interested me in terms of something that really was missing. There's more scholarship and, books and other things about disability in the past, just some. But I really wanted to think about the here and now, because, right now we're all living through history too. But, many people don't realize that the way that we're living now is significant. And I think many disabled people think so many of our practices and what we do every day is not a big deal, right? It's not, but it's mundane. It's what we do to survive. It's what we do to adapt. But there's so much brilliance and just beauty and creativity that I saw in my friends, that I saw in the communities I'm with. And I really was so I feel like we gotta capture these things. So much of any culture is ephemeral, and so it just started with this feeling of such a completeness of so much work and wisdom that's out there. And I just felt like people's stories need to be told, and people needed to know that their stories mattered, right? Like you don't have to be an icon, you don't have to be famous. I really was very much interested in everyday stories from everyday people. Really wanted to give people a mechanism to tell their own stories versus, some other way. And I think that's the empowering aspect too, that people are in control of their narratives, which I think for a long time, disabled narratives have not been centered on the actual person. Like for a long time, even now, traditionally, other people have told our stories for us. So I think to me, those are important things to recognize the agency and also to recognize the significance of every story, no matter, what it's about, is still significant to me.
I think when thinking about priorities and responsibilities, I too feel a responsibility to disabled people in the present moment and also to disabled people in history. So part of my work is more historical, and the other part is really thinking about how living disabled people feel their way through archives and experience themselves in history. Some of my research has been focused around disabled people who use archives, definitely thinking about disabled people who do not use archives because of the ways they're inaccessible. And then I'm currently sort of starting a project on the ways disabled archivists feel doing this kind of labor in archives. And so I think a lot of my interests and my responsibilities are thinking about the complexities of feeling when dealing with history and gathering stories on disabled experiences. And I'll just put like my researcher hat on for a brief moment, but when collecting these stories from folks, consent is really important to this kind of research for me. So I get consent to interview people in advance, to record those interviews, for people to have control over how they're named or not named or identified or described in writing. And I also have check-ins about consent during the interviews because we're usually talking about historical violences, often crying together. So making sure consent is still happening and in relation to our conversations. But then consent doesn't stop at the end of the interview. I know that research can be extractive. I know that I gain academic capital from publishing this research or writing about it. So I really consider my responsibilities long-term and my relationships with these folks, who, a lot of whom are within my communities, long-term. So I continue to get their consent in anything that I write, where they have so many different opportunities to edit, to change how they want to be cited, to give me feedback on pieces overall. And I really, truly am just like so grateful for these relationships and their commitment to this research, my relationship with them, their relationships as a cohort when I connect them, and our relationships to disabled people across history. It's really such a great privilege to get to see that kind of community and accountability and community building, which I think is a particular joy because in highlighting their words and their decisions, because our experiences or disabled people's experiences are not just abstract or theoretical, but are actually coming from these really lived, real experiences that is such a joy to show others.
Yeah, and I want to just to jump in with what you just said about, how it doesn't end at the end of an interview, because it also acknowledges that the interviewee or participants can change their mind. Their thoughts have changed after the experience. And that, if researchers truly do care and have, want to do right, especially when collecting stories from a marginalized community, that they have to give people the means to shape and reshape what they want archived. And I think that's probably still challenging for some researchers. It does take a lot more work and care, but it can be done. And I think it says a lot about the relationship that the researcher has with their subject, right? It's not just this power dynamic where it's so asymmetrical, even though there is an asymmetrical dynamic, but you are giving the person as much agency to kind of, decide to withdraw, to decide to edit maybe half of it, to delete half, I think that's really important. I participated in one just about a year ago, I think. Through NYU, there was an APA Voices COVID-19 Public Memory Project. I'm going to drop the link. This is through NYU. And Rochelle Kwan is one of my friends, and she worked on the project, and she interviewed me, and it was really, you could tell that there was a protocol, because they had different steps and stages. And I was asked throughout the entire process whether, to check in. It was like, wow, I felt what changes I want to be. And there was a lot of care. And I think this is, again, just like what I mentioned earlier at the start of this event, that any sort of effort like an online event or, archival work, it takes a lot of care and just thoughtfulness. And I think that's something that hopefully everybody who's interested in telling stories and everybody who's interested in archiving stories really kind of put that, to emphasize that, to really put your care and intentionalities kind of out there, and to be transparent about it.
Absolutely. I think those ethics of care, I mean, it really connects to the idea of access is love that you brought into the chat, and that I think continues to be such a rallying cry for so many of us in the disabled community, because that is what it is. And on the flip side, inaccessibility is some sort of anti-love, like it is exclusion. It is not even being able to interface with folks because we're just not in the room. So kind of going to Gracen's reflections on the past, and then we're going to also think about looking forward with the next question. How do we look to the past to witness disabled people and disabled ancestors, and remembering to also, think about multiply marginalized disabled people, that's not just white disabled people out there, in history, and how does that inform the work that y'all do now?
Gracen, I think you should take that first.
Sure. I think it's hard. I feel like a lot of my more historical work is just like looking through absence. And a lot of my research is like based on my own experience of doing this historical research of looking for disabled people in history and not being able to find them. And when I do, yeah, it's predominantly white disabled people, or I'm finding really problematic or limited or stereotypical or violent records that portray disabled people as deviant, as dangerous, as dirty, you know, like through, I think, some of Sue Schweik's work on the ugly laws. And I think this is why Alice's work is so important, is creating this plethora of first-person narratives that are accessible to folks interested in thinking through the complexities of disabled experiences. So I really think that sets a beautiful model for not only like representation, but also disability or disabled archiving, to invert what people might traditionally think of as archives, which are often inaccessible buildings or behind paywalls, or one needs institutional affiliation, or even I want to just acknowledge the inaccessibility of feeling uncomfortable being in those kinds of spaces, being in archival spaces, in the reading rooms, which can be places of surveillance or where there's certain expectations around how you behave if you're not familiar with it, can be quite uncomfortable. Plus you can't emote. In a lot of the reading rooms, there are these silent spaces where you can't yell or cry while you're amongst other researchers. So I guess I don't know if that really answers the question about specifically looking to the past, but I think sometimes the past can't give us what we might so strongly desire. And I think there's something in being able to hold those problematic records with love and care and know that even if you get to find something, what you're seeing in front of you isn't a complete picture. And then I think thinking in the present of creating history now for the future of generating these stories that need to be documented.
Yeah, and I think, I'm a little of that. I have a different role from Gracen in terms of we both overlap in a lot of ways. But a lot of my kind of work, I think, is about creating archival or just stories that are really just out in the open and free and public. That was also an intentional choice, right? Like, I want things to be as accessible as possible. It's not always perfect, but telling stories in many different modes and forms as possible is another form of access that I think, again, archival research is another. I think it comes in all forms too, but there's, I think, more traditional forms, right? So, I see a much more expansive idea of what archives would look like. I think it could be a podcast, I edited my podcast last April with episode 100. And I thought that's a good number to edit on. And, in many ways, I think of it as a living, breathing archive. That's, out there from 2017 to, 2021, which is kind of wild. But that to me is exciting that this thing is out there on multiple platforms. It can reach people in all kinds of ways. There's text transcripts, and there's additional show notes. But this is one form of storytelling. Just as being an editor, I'm not maybe I'm a lay archivist, but I don't know. I mean, am I an archivist? I don't know. But, I think being an editor also has that kind of function where I'm curating things from the past and present. And I think for me, the reason why I'm doing a lot of the work about the here and now is really to create dialogue for people who are alive today, to be a dialogue with the past, but really to also be a dialogue with the future. I'm thinking a lot ahead about what do we leave behind? What do we want to leave behind? Which also shapes the choices that the people I talk to and the stories that I choose to publish. So for me, one of the guiding principles is, am I curious and interested in this person? Does that bring me joy? Yes, no, I think so. And that to me is, it's my own kind of personality, my own choice. And I think that's also exciting too, that I do have a particular point of view. I do have a set of interests and priorities. And yes, a political agenda. So, that's very apparent too. I think if anybody wants to know, for example, what I stand for, who I am, to just to look at the things that I amplify and publish and share. So it's less about me, it's more about people who I think need to be heard and need to be seen, because I think there's still so many people that are not getting the spotlights, that are not being, people need to know, and I think people need to appreciate so many of the disabled people today who are still alive. Like this, I think a lot about the phrase give people their flowers. And especially these last 2 years, I don't want to wait until somebody dies, until we start kind of appreciating them. Let's stop that. Let's embrace the friendships and relationships we have now. Let's do everything in our power to tell the stories, or to amplify the existing stories and or archives out there, because life is so short. So I think that's always in the back of my mind when I do this work as an editor or as a writer, to leave my own stories. It's just there's this urgency, because so many times we don't appreciate or don't recognize people until they're dead. And I think there's such a kind of lack of appreciation that really makes me very salty. So that's another reason why I do my work.
As both of you are talking about this, I'm thinking about the way that we normalize or expect, like, what does a archived body look like? What does a present body look like? There's this expectation of like, oh, we're all gonna live to be like 80, so we only need to interview the elders right now, right? And it's like, well, not everyone has that life expectancy. Life expectancy is based on race, it's based on disability, it's based on so many gender, right? Like so many trans folks are killed every single year, and most of them are trans folks of color. And I think just the way that white supremacy is built into the archive, you know, like we were talking about earlier at the very beginning about mass disabling events, like enslavement, that's a mass disabling event, but we don't think about disability when we're talking about slavery, or about building, you know, all of the infrastructure that modernism relies on. So I think thinking about that word of legibility is helpful to me. So Alice kind of was getting to this question, but I want to open the floor for you to answer it as well, Gracen. Why is it important to archive stories, artifacts, and works by disabled people? And what do you hope to leave behind with your collections? In other words, how do you want to be remembered in the future? And what traces do we leave now?
Yeah, I think the urgency issue is one of great importance, and one that is at the top of my mind as an archivist. For me, it is about complexity, it is about nuance, it's about complicating disabled stories and histories. I'm at the very, very beginning stages of building a disability-centered digital archive that both aggregates historical records and digitizes folks' records from today, to capture all of this amazing knowledge that disabled people produce, and acknowledging that we are rapidly losing our disabled pieces of our disabled community these days, and think about, you know, how disabled stories get obscured in various ways, through what records get created, what records get kept, then how they might be described, and how all of that impacts access. So this archive, I think, allows me to talk about, I guess, how to think through how disabled people might want to be remembered in the future, and how to actively support that. So this archive will be community-led and community-designed. But I think a piece of it is about not flattening narratives, so allowing for conflicting narratives, allowing for conflicting stories, and thinking about how, I guess, multiple layers and perspectives and connections between people and histories and politics. Yeah, and thinking quite urgently of the folks who are with us, who have materials that we want to preserve.
I am so excited about Grace's project. It's really going to be super awesome. And I think especially for the field, I think it's going to be really on the cutting edge of developing new methodologies, new practices, new approaches that's hopefully we'll see like throughout, you know, archival work. But I think this is, you know, I'm a fan of Grace's work, and I think we definitely need more scholarship in this area. So for anybody who just supports this Disability Archives Lab, please do, because I think we need this. It's just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's so many, I think, disability cultures and communities. There's only so much, you know, some archives you do, right? We're just kind of barely touching the surface. But if I could just related to that, the complexities of archives, the nuances, the messiness, you know, this last year, you know, I've had the gift of writing my own memoir. So like, in many ways, it's a collected works. And I've had to kind of come through my own archives in a lot of ways. It's kind of wild, but this is an archive of one. And it's kind of like a mini archive in one book where you'll see pre-published pieces, already published pieces, photos, poetry, other artifacts, and some new work. But it's been such a gift and a privilege to be able to leave something behind that's about myself. It's not the narrative, it's not the story or about me, but it's one slice. And yeah, to be able to shape this and offer it and not give some sort of super simple, pithy kind of heart of who I am as a person. That to me was important, to really kind of make people think about, like, you know, how we should have stories that aren't always super simple, that aren't always kind of linear or, kind of immediately understandable. I think that to me is exciting. That's, archives and stories can actually be much more about being a catalyst in terms of trying to mobilize and invigorate people and to provoke people to action. So that's the intention of my memoir too, is in many ways to challenge and provoke the reader. But also it's just been really fun to like put something together that includes art and all kinds of things. It's a kind of a more of a scrapbook than any sort of grand narrative about my life. So that to me has been the thing that I've worked on in the last year and a half that's really given me a lot of joy. And my goodness, what a gift it's been to be able to do that and to leave it behind for the future kids out there. Future kids out there that's maybe Asian or Asian American and disabled that don't feel seen, don't feel represented, that this is going to be one of hopefully many things that are out there to let them know, like, you're not alone, and we've always been around, but here is one of many stories, and we're clearly not a monolith.
Just to build on that, I will also plug Alice's book, which I'm so excited about. But something that you said really resonated with me about being a catalyst. And I think for me to thinking about disability archiving is not just about the stuff. So for me, a huge piece of building this archive is, yes, about the stuff, but also about making space to train disabled people as archivists, to then have more disabled people in archives all over the place and shape the archival profession. So also not just thinking about the future of how we want to be remembered, but thinking about us as doing the work to do that remembering, to do the work of collecting and bearing witness to disabled stories in history that others might not be able to perceive. So it's thinking, I guess, I'm thinking about the future of disabled people, the future of archives, and the future of disabled people intervening in archives in many different ways, like outside of a single project.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about, like, I'm helping to create right now an oral history archive at my job at the National Public Housing Museum, and there are so many norms in the archival profession that are just like fundamentally ableist, just like fundamentally like, oh yeah, we're not going to have transcripts because we value orality in oral history. It's like, Okay, that's just like, that's gonna be a no from me. We are going to have transcripts for everyone. So I think it's so important that more disabled folks are in the profession, and academia is such an ableist institution, and that's part of why there aren't more of us. So it's important to create those other training pathways, as Gracen is talking about. And you both kind of created a great lead into the next question that I have. Apparently heterogeneity is one of my favorite words, Carlin, because that's in this question too. So, when the three of us were first, came together and were writing the promotional materials for this event, there was a point at which we were like, do we use the pronouns we or they, talking about the disabled community? And what this really conjured for me was the fact that, like, we each have our own positionalities as disabled folks with our specific experiences, but the disabled community is so heterogeneous. It's so diverse, and so many different ways in which you can be disabled. And so I was wondering if y'all can talk to how that diversity of experience impacts and shapes your work around disability and disabled stories. And I guess, how do you get not complacent, right? And like, oh yeah, I'm doing a good job. Like, how do you continue to challenge yourself in that regard?
Yeah, I think I'm constantly learning all the time, and I don't claim to be an expert on access. I don't claim to be. I try not to claim too many things. That to me is my way of preempting all of my kind of like, any chances of kind of being more than what I am. So I really want to like keep it real with people. Be real about my own capacity, my own biases, my own points of view, because that's what they are, right? Like, just lay it out there. And lately I've been learning a lot from people who are blind and deafblind, especially around one form of access that, especially during these kind of online events, there is a tradition, a due practice that at the beginning of an event, an online event or a meeting on Zoom, people describe themselves, just what they look like. And the intention is really to give people who can't see or can't see as well an idea of who's presenting. But then there's been some pushback by blind and deafblind people saying, like, this is actually very performative. It's really for the benefit of non-blind people, and that many of these kind of descriptions are completely not helpful and not useful. And that really was like, wow, like, oh my God, like, I've been doing this for lots of meetings, and it really gave me pause to think about, like, am I doing this wrong, or should I be continuing to do this? So I think being open to critique and also be agile in terms of, changing your processes, changing your practices, to really try to be as informed by the many heterogeneous parts of the community. I think that's, it's an evolution, just nothing to really stay static. And a lot of my work in the last, if I look at some of the things I published, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, I'm like, oh, so cringy. Like, oh, I wish like, things have gotten better. And I'm like, at least that's something I just recognize. Like, when I cringe at what I've done in the past, I'm like, okay, I must have learned a few things along the way. But I'm also recognizing that there's so much I need to learn, but also be okay with not knowing everything, because it's frequently impossible, and there's no such thing as perfection. just as there's no such thing as universal access, there just isn't. This idea of universal design, universal access really sets up this false idea, this false kind of rule, because people are different, body minds are different, that there will be conflicts within this very broad group. So, these things do play out, within community conflicts. And I think those are things that are also important to recognize too. So, however we do what we do, I think just be as transparent about your methods, your intentions, your approach. I think that's the best way to move forward. It's just to be as honest as possible and to try to improve what you can. I think that to me is kind of what's been how I try to trick myself.
Yeah, I think listening and making mistakes is inherent in the process. And holding complexities and contradictions when people need different things for access needs. I usually find myself not even saying disabled community, but saying communities, as to not slip into assuming a monolith. And in my writing too, I try to be very mindful of when I say we, because I am part of the research that I'm doing, and when some folks who I interview who hold identities that I don't and are speaking to that experience and being disabled, that I don't assume that we are the same in writing and say we. And I find that in particular is really paying close attention to disabled people of color and really knowing that there are differences that really need to be honored and recognized. I don't know if I have much more to add to what Alice already said. I would just be repeating what you said. I think, yeah, we're always learning, and I think disabled people have different disabilities and illnesses and intersecting identities and needs and nuances and politics, and there's never, as Alice said, there's never the perfect. We always are just holding space with each other and learning.
Yeah, and I would just add that there are times in certain venues where I do use we politically. I think there are spaces where, let's say it's not all disabled people, let's say it's majority non-disabled people, whether it's a journal article or an op-ed or some sort of, conference where I do use me because it's, us, it's about us, and it's about us in comparison to the larger society, which is, for the most part, not disabled and ableist. So I really want to make that distinction in certain contexts, because it is a deliberate political choice to use we sometimes. And even though, again, you can't it's impossible to generalize. It's dangerous to generalize, but I think when I try to say things broadly, I do try to say based on my understanding, based on my own experience, plus what I've learned from others. These are my go-to disclaimers, but I do use we in larger, broader contexts, broader environments to really push forward that there is a we, because let's face it, there are non-disabled people who don't believe that there is a way in terms of disabled people as a culture, as many cultures, as many communities. So they just don't even acknowledge that. So those are the times when I use we.
That's such a good point. And we get so easily individualized in our struggles to get our access needs met, or with discrimination and with these interactions, that yeah, that is such a good point, that the we really matters sometimes.
Yeah, and so often, like, we might be like the only ones in the room, and so creating that we is like really intentional, and it takes effort and labor, and so it's something to claim. You know, like I came to know Alice's work like a lot of people did through Twitter, and like honestly, I literally joined Twitter for Crip Twitter, like for disabled Twitter. Like that's what I grew up with. Twitter, no, didn't have it at all until then, because it was like, this is the way for me to access that community that I am not getting in my personal life. We have a question from the audience from Lil. So they say, I was really interested in what Gracen said about making archival footage more accessible and adaptive to non-academic communities. What does community engagement look like for y'all when archiving and disseminating disabled narratives? If possible, might you expand on what that looks like practically and in praxis?
I can start. I guess for the work that I'm doing now, I think part of that is elevating disabled people's voices through the interviews, which I think then it has a way of making concepts more accessible through plain language. But I'm also currently working on hiring someone to make plain language versions of my articles to further increase their access, which is a journey to translate academic writing into plain language. And then for the digital archive that I'm working on, it is a slow process of even designing it. So it's nothing now, because it is starting with paid focus groups for disabled people to describe even what they need for access in an archive, or how they want to use archives, how they want to experience an archive. So that is, like, I guess, really taking my time with a design process with disabled communities to make sure that an archives project and disseminating disabled narratives is centering community needs. And then I'm also in the process, I have an undergraduate student who's been working with me to produce a blog as part of the lab, which I'm really excited about, because that will be more casual, accessible narratives about the research that we're doing, and about, hopefully eventually, about pieces or collections in the archive as well.
Alice, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think Gracen answered it.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. I think slowness is so underrated in so much research. We talk about that a lot in oral history, because compared to other methodologies, it can be very slow, but it goes, like, that is the result of being true to your values in terms of consent and in terms of getting that community input and all of that. So this is going to be a bit of a meta moment. So someone was asking in the chat about the video, and I wanted to bring this up because this is something we talked about prior to the event, about kind of how long do things exist on the internet, and kind of, you know, the digital age creates all of this trail of things that might live on forever, or maybe we make the decision to not have that be the case. So let's talk about the ethics of recording and archiving, and as they pertain to accessibility and disability, kind of how you thread that needle in terms of meeting access needs while also being conscious and cognizant of all the other issues that arise.
I can take this first, since I think I was the initial person to ask questions around it. I think just as an archivist, I often think about what records we create and what things we leave behind, ways of remembering and forgetting. And I really love virtual events because they can be experienced from different locations, at different speeds, with recordings at different moments, with captioning and interpretation, as we're seeing today. And I think hands down access is important, and I am 100% yes on that. But I think what also comes up in my mind, especially over the past couple of years, when I've been invited to speak about my own experiences, and in particular around some traumatic things, I think, what does it mean? I guess I just ask the question about, what does it mean when we're asked to be vulnerable or talk about traumatic things in public, and what does it mean to record that and keep those moments for people to be able to revisit, or for those recordings to potentially outlast us. And so I guess for access, it's so important, but it also just arises these questions of what records then are created about us, about disabled communities. So I'm quite mindful of doing things for disabled people. Yeah, but always asking questions, that not being just the default, but it being intentional access.
Yeah, and it could be access that's a little bit like, reshaped. It could be kind of modified in a way that, especially if it's about you, you should feel good about it. I think a lot about how there is this weird expectation that disabled people still bear so much of themselves in various venues for all kinds of reasons, right? Sometimes it's things we do want to talk about, that we do want to make public, but then, there's also things where there's a strange, again, it depends on the organizers and the host and the theme of the event, but there are some spaces that are just much more, I think, voyeuristic and exploitative. And so those are times when, I think having more concerns about having a limited time to have this available is really warranted. I think another thing that people didn't realize is that, archives can be weaponized, right? They can be used to harm people and harm the actual people who are participating, later on. So I think it's also seen as a measure of self-protection too, when people say, actually, should we take out this part? Should we make this only available, for a month or a week? Because I don't want this to be out there forever and ever. Whether it's because your employer or just other things is just hard drives can also be harmful. And I think that's another, that could be a whole other event, but hard drives can cause harm to actual people, living people. And I think that's also kind of fascinating, the way that they can be weaponized. And that's another whole ethical snowball.
Yeah, it goes back to a lot of the issues that Gracen raised early on about that consent process and the iterative consent process, right? And like, it's really big difference if you have a relationship with the event organizer and you could email them and say like, oh, I've changed my mind, I think I want to take this off, versus that just being the default. And it's like, okay, well, this is going to live on in perpetuity, right? So we have another question from Peggy. How do you conduct your interviews to make them accessible for people with intellectual disabilities? And have you included interviews with parents or siblings of people with significant disabilities as to their experiences?
I can start if Alice wants to follow up. So I have not conducted interviews with parents or siblings of folks as of this point. But the way that I try to make my interviews accessible, I always send all of the questions in advance. I will sometimes rewrite the questions if people need them rephrased, or during the interview, I'll rephrase them multiple times or ask shorter questions or different questions. We always take breaks, though that's always on the table for folks to process what we're talking about. And then I have like captions or interpretation, ASL interpretation as needed for folks to have other methods of receiving the information. I also offer people options to respond through an interview by chat. We can do that, or just by email if they want the questions, and then they can respond. And I've done that a couple of times. And then I think with when I'm writing up what I am seeing within the interviews, that is also, again, another time for them to revisit their own words and edit them and see how I describe them, and another opportunity for us to have a conversation about our previous conversation. But I will let Alice describe what she does.
Yeah, I think similar to your methods, in addition to what Gracen just mentioned, I try to, whoever I'm talking to, at the beginning, the digital contact is like, what are your access needs? And then try to go from there. So just really let the person drive how the interview should take place. So let's say it's a person with an intellectual disability. More often time or not, it's like, we just have a conversation. It's not all that different, but with people with, let's say, communication disabilities, or as Peggy mentioned, significant disabilities, sometimes they have somebody with them that facilitates the conversation. And that's, but if that's what they need, if that's how they communicate, that's, the way I'm gonna, that's what it means to be flexible and accommodating. Sometimes people use assistive technology to speak. So like Gracen, I will prepare questions ahead of time. So that's, let's say they want to type their answers ahead of time. That's what I've done with my podcast. I talked with somebody with a computer speech generated device. I give them, usually podcasts or interviews, they want people to be like spontaneous, but that doesn't always work for people who need to type and take time to type. So what I did with that interview, in most of my other interviews too, I gave questions in advance, because a lot of people appreciate that. Neurodivergent folks, all kinds of folks. Just happy. Some people are just, whether you're disabled or not, some people are just nervous. And I think the role of any archivist or any researcher, to be honest, or interviewer, is to help make the person feel comfortable, to help them make them feel safe in whatever ways. And if they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel safe, then we can stop. We don't have to do this. And I would never want to make somebody feel like they have to be forced to do something in a way that doesn't work for them. So that's, hopefully something that I emphasize, and hopefully something that we can beat together in terms of finding a way that makes them feel good during that experience. And if it didn't feel good, then I would definitely not publish it or not to do anything with it. There was one interview I did with a person with Down syndrome who again about technology. It's interesting. He was based in Latin America, and his parents wanted to be there in the interview with him, and they were also translating from English to Spanish. And we also had a very bad internet connection. So it was a very complicated interview. And I also had to get things translated once I got the recording. And to be honest, there was so much lost in translation that there's a lot of starts and stops. And I could tell by the person's responses and the way that the parents were translating, but also the parent was talking to the person, was answering for the person. I could tell that was happening. And that made me a little uncomfortable too, because that person I felt like that person really wasn't saying everything they wanted to say. At least that was the vibe I got. So, as we finished the interview, it really felt like it was an awkward and disjointed conversation with so many things in play that, I basically, at the end, after I got a chance to run, I'm like, wow, this is really not what I think they would like, and not what I felt good about in terms of being really centered on that person. Then I basically said, thank you for talking with me, but, due to the technical things, the things that kept freezing, there was a lot of starts and stops. And just, I don't think this is the quality of the interview that we can really publish. And I was really nervous that they would be bad because they spent their time with me, but I really wanted to let them know, I didn't feel good about releasing this, and I don't think they would have felt comfortable releasing it either. And, they agreed to that. And I'm just really lucky that they were okay with that. But I think that's also the prerogative of the researcher / interviewer, because there are times where something happens either during or throughout that just isn't right. It doesn't feel right. And those are the times we just say this is not something that I think I should use. Not to say I could use, but this is something that I should not use because it's not really centered on that person. So I think maybe that really taught me, I guess, futures, future in the future to really be much more to plan ahead, and also to maybe I needed to have somebody that spoke Spanish on my behalf. Just thought about all these different things I should do if this happens again. And this all kind of is a learning moment, and that's something I'm really grateful to them that they gave me the grace to, understand where I was coming from.
Thank you for that. I know a theme that I feel like has been coming up, but we haven't explicitly named is autonomy, right? Like autonomy of the people who are participating and centering their experiences and their perspectives and needs and wants and everything. So this is another question. This is from Oscar, who is a library and information technology student. And they say it's a bit of a technical question, but anyone can jump in. They are in the process of learning about rules for archival description now, and they are wondering if you had any comments on the way that those technical standards do or do not serve disabled archive practitioners as well as users in terms of description and access concerns that have been such an important component of this session.
Gracen, this one's for you.
Yeah. First off, yay, more disabled people in the field. But language is complex. I think many of us know it, and it is constantly changing. It is not ever stagnant. And I think that makes archival description hard because it needs to be, in my opinion, needs to be constantly revisited, as well as, I guess, if anyone has read Emily Jerbinsky's piece on using queer theory in cataloging, she critiques Library of Congress subject headings and thinks through the politics of correcting. So not simply to correct harmful language, but to acknowledge it and add to it. So I think there's something in that flexibility and addressing it while not ignoring what has happened in the past. And I think, you know, also archivists are just grappling with how, you know, standards do accomplish something. Guidelines allow us to talk about components of things, but they're never complete. There's no, just like there's no checklist for access, there's no checklist for the right way to do description. And I guess the only thing that I can really point to is that it is always, I think, in doing archival work, it's always balancing resources, you know, describing and redescribing and researching takes time and money and resources, and lots of archives are underfunded or time is limited, and balancing that with efforts and nuance and responsibility. The Society of the American Archivists section for accessibility and disability, I think that's what we're called, is revising some guidelines around disability and accessibility that I would recommend. I can look up the link when I have a minute, but that's being revised currently by a group of people. So there are groups of disabled people in archives, professional organizations who are also grappling with this, which I think is pretty exciting to get to see. But yeah, standards. Whew.
It's a whole conversation. We love beating up on the Library of Congress. But that's a good reminder, though. Thank you for saying that, Gracen, about like it's never done and revision is like a part of the process. Because like as someone who like entered a job 4 months ago with like an archive of 150 interviews that had like barely been processed, I'm like very much like trying to like have a system of like start, finish, okay, that one's done, start, finish, that one's done, right? And it's like, you totally understand the impulse, but it's actually okay to be in that state of like, okay, maybe it's done for now, maybe it's done to a point and we'll return to it. let's see. So Ashwine, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, asked, in this context, thinking of traditional analog and even digital archives and archival materials other than recordings, what are considerations to be kept in mind, thought of in terms of access for posterity?
This is something I'm grappling with my website and all the things that I create that are out there on the internet. Like this is the big question, right? I do have my website backed up in case something crashes. I think, things that are online are really subject to a lot of vulnerabilities, right? Just as things that are housed in a actual building. So there's a lot of precautions you can take, but I think, getting things backed up, getting things in multiple copies in different modes, just as a, if that's possible. But that is something that I'm personally grappling with right now, thinking about the future. And I think that's I wish I had the answers for that, but I'm just really just somebody that just that tries to back things up, lots of different ways, and also tell as many different stories in as many different kinds of mediums, so that if one bunch fails, one day if there's some sort of huge, you know, Olympic event, that maybe some other parts will survive. So I'm trying to hedge my bets and try to diversify. So I think that's my dystopian answer.
I would just add to that too, just thinking about who's making the decisions like over time too. So I guess thinking about access and posterity over long periods of time, sometimes folks have their archival material donated to an archives after their death, or a family member donates it. And so thinking about all of the questions that arise around maintaining records, where you may not be able to ask that person what they want to currently happen with their records, which is not an answer, but I think I'll just add that.
So we're just about at the end of our time. We have one last audience question that I think we can fit in. So this is from Michelle. Do you utilize people with disabilities to assist you in interviewing and or archiving the information that you gather from your interviews?
My lab is all disabled people. And so yes, and in interviewing, the current project that I'm doing with disabled archivists, I have a collaborator who's disabled and then an undergraduate student who I'm getting to teach about like the whole research process, who sits in on all the interviews and conducts them with me, and then helps me process them and transcribe them and analyze them and write about them. And it is a great joy to get to do this work with other disabled people. This is my first research project of this nature that is like very, very collaborative. I just recently got a job as an assistant professor, so I have the resources to invite and pay other people, which has been amazing.
Yeah, and I think most of the interviews I've done has always been by myself, but in other projects such as my podcast and other online publications, I do work with disabled people who are my co-audio producers. And I also, exclusively work with disabled people to create plain language versions of various things that I publish, such as my anthology, which came out in 2020. That was written by, there was a discussion guide by a disabled writer, and there was a plain language version of the anthology that's also free on my website. And that's also by a disabled writer. So I try to hire and pay as many disabled people as possible as independent contractors on various projects. So I try to do that as much as I can.
Well, thank you both so much. We are at the end of our time. This conversation could continue much longer, but this is going to be it for us tonight. So thank you again. We will be sending out all the links, the many abundance of links. So no need to try to scramble before the session is closed out. We'll send those all to you. Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.